Ambassador Tyvan Shakal of the Varenthi Empire sat in the great curved hall of the Galactic Concord Assembly, and tried very hard to remember the name of the human delegate sitting 14 rows below him. He could not. It was not that the human was forgettable in appearance, because all humans looked strange to Varenthi eyes with their soft skin and flat faces, and those odd little patches of hair above their eyes that moved when they were emotional, which seemed to be always. It was simply that humanity did not matter. The Concord had existed for over 12,000 years, and it held within its borders more than 400 species, each of them tested by time and proven worthy of their place among the stars. And then there were the humans who had stumbled into galactic society only 83 years ago with their clunky ships and their strange enthusiasm and their endless questions about everything. Today the human delegate was once again requesting expanded access to the trade corridors near the outer rim, the same request they had made 9 times before. And once again, the senior members of the assembly barely looked up from their data screens as the request was denied. Shakal watched the human delegate nod politely and sit back down without argument, and he thought to himself that this was the defining quality of humanity, a species that accepted rejection with a quiet smile, and then came back to ask again, as though persistence alone could replace 10,000 years of galactic influence. The general opinion of humanity among the elder species was not unkind, but it was deeply dismissive. Humans were classified as endurance predators from a high-gravity death world, which sounded impressive until you learned that their primary evolutionary strategy had been to chase animals, until those animals collapsed from exhaustion, which the Varenthi found both horrifying and deeply unimpressive at the same time. Their ships were considered a joke among Concord engineers because they were packed with redundant systems and backup power cores and emergency everything, as though the humans expected every single component to fail at any moment, which to the elegant Varenthi mind was not engineering, but paranoia given physical form. They trained their crews constantly, running drills and simulations for scenarios so unlikely that Varenthi military analysts had calculated the odds and found them statistically irrelevant. And when asked why they did this, the humans would simply say that they liked to be ready, which was the kind of answer that made the Varenthi smile politely and change the subject. On the far side of the galaxy from that assembly hall, in a quiet command center orbiting a small blue world called Earth, Admiral Constance Leclerc of the United Terran Navy was not smiling. She stood before a wall of intelligence data that her analysts had been compiling for 11 months, and every single piece of it pointed to the same conclusion. The Draelith hegemony was mobilizing. The Draelith were not members of the Concord, and they had not been for centuries, not since they had decided that cooperation was for species too weak to take what they wanted, and they had spent the time since then building an empire through conquest on the far side of the galactic core, where the Concord preferred not to look. Leclerc's intelligence teams had tracked fleet movements, supply chain activations, communication surges, and the construction of forward staging platforms in neutral space that pointed directly at the Concord's frontier territories. She had compiled this data into a formal threat assessment, and she had presented it personally to the Concord's combined military advisory council, where she had stood in her crisp black uniform before a room full of alien admirals and generals who commanded fleets that dwarfed humanity's registered forces by a factor of 50. They had listened politely. Then they had told her that the Draelith had not waged open war against the Concord in over 600 years, and that humanity's intelligence apparatus was young and prone to misinterpretation, and that perhaps the humans should focus on their trade corridor petition and leave military analysis to species with more experience. Leclerc had nodded politely, just as her diplomatic colleagues always did. Then she had returned to Earth and walked into the deepest level of Terran strategic command, where she sat down across from the Joint Chiefs of the United Terran Navy, and she said 2 words. "Activate Longwatch." The room went very still. Protocol Longwatch was not something that existed in any database the Conquered could access, and it was not something humanity had ever mentioned to its galactic neighbors, because humanity had learned a very long time ago that you do not tell potential rivals how sharp your teeth really are. Longwatch was a contingency framework that had been created in humanity's first decade as a Conquered member, back when the first human ambassadors had looked around at the galaxy and seen exactly what Leclerc saw now, a civilization so old and so comfortable that it had forgotten what real danger looked like. It had been updated every single year since then. It had been wargamed thousands of times. It covered every conceivable scenario from border skirmishes to full galactic war, and it had been maintained with the kind of obsessive dedication that only a species with humanity's history could sustain, because humans knew something that the Conquered had forgotten. Peace was not the natural state of the universe. Peace was a thing you built and maintained and defended, and if you ever stopped defending it, then something with sharper teeth would come along and tear it apart. No one in the Conquered had ever asked what Longwatch was, because no one in the Conquered had ever cared what humanity was doing in its little corner of the outer rim. And that was perfectly fine with Admiral Leclerc, because the best contingency plan was one that no one knew existed until the moment it was needed. 3 weeks after Leclerc activated Longwatch, the Draelith hegemony made its move. They came out of deep space with a fleet of 9,000 warships arranged in the classic Draelith conquest formation, a massive hammer designed to crush resistance in a single overwhelming blow, and they aimed that hammer directly at the Cathari homeworld. The Cathari were one of the founding species of the Conquered, a gentle and deeply philosophical people who had helped write the original Charter of Galactic Cooperation 12,000 years ago, and they had a defense fleet of exactly 300 ships because they believed that the Conquered's Mutual Defense Pact would protect them. The Conquered's Mutual Defense Pact required a unanimous vote of the Security Council to activate. The Security Council was still debating the wording of a preliminary resolution when the Draelith fleet entered the Cathari system. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted 16 hours. The Cathari defense fleet fought bravely and died to the last ship, and then the Draelith turned their weapons on the planet itself, not to destroy it completely, but to break it so thoroughly that every other species in the Conquered would see the footage and understand what was coming for them. 7 billion Cathari died in those 16 hours. When the news reached the Conquered assembly, there was silence, the kind of silence that falls when an entire civilization realizes at the same moment that the world they thought they lived in no longer exists. Ambassador Shakal sat in his chair and watched the footage of the Cathari homeworld burning, and he felt something he had not felt in his entire diplomatic career. Fear. Real fear. Not the abstract political anxiety of a trade negotiation gone wrong, but the deep primal terror of a prey animal that has just heard a predator's footstep in the dark. And somewhere on the far side of the galaxy, Admiral Constance Leclerc watched the same footage with a face like carved stone, and she turned to her command staff and said quietly, "Longwatch Phase 2, begin fleet recall, all reserves to active status, start bringing them home." The galaxy had made a terrible mistake, and it did not even know the shape of that mistake, yet because the mistake was not ignoring the Draelith threat. The mistake was ignoring humanity. The galaxy burned, and the Conquered could not agree on how to put out the fire. In the 6 weeks following the destruction of the Cathari homeworld, the Draelith hegemony advanced along 3 separate axes of attack, each one driving deep into Conquered territory like a knife sliding between ribs, and every species that sat on the Security Council had a different opinion about what to do, and none of those opinions involved listening to anyone else. The Varenthi Empire mobilized its famous precision fleet. 400 gleaming warships built around the doctrine of long-range bombardment, the idea being that if you could kill your enemy from far enough away, then war became clean and elegant and civilized, which was a very Varenthi way of thinking about mass death. The Urani Collective launched its dreadnought Armada, 200 of the largest warships in the Conquered, each one the size of a small moon and carrying enough firepower to crack a planet's crust, because the Urani believed that size was strength and that nothing could stand before the sheer overwhelming mass of their war machines. The Tessic Dominion deployed its electronic warfare fleet, ships that carried almost no weapons at all, but could blind enemy sensors and scramble communications, and turn an opposing fleet deaf and blind in the void, because the Tessic believed that information was the only weapon that mattered. Each of these fleets was impressive on its own, and each of them operated under its own command structure, with its own doctrine, and its own communication protocols, and its own idea of what victory looked like. And they were sent into battle against the Dralith without any meaningful coordination between them, because the Conquered had never actually built a unified military command. It had never needed one. War between major powers had been unthinkable for so long that the Mutual Defense Pact was treated like a ceremonial document rather than an operational framework. And now that document was being tested for the first time in living memory, and it was failing. The first battle of the Sorathi Corridor was a disaster. The Varenthi Precision Fleet engaged a Dralith advance force at extreme range and began picking off enemy ships with their characteristic accuracy. But the Dralith did not behave the way the Varenthi war simulations predicted. Instead of retreating from the bombardment, they charged directly into close range, where the Varenthi ships had almost no defensive capability, and the Precision Fleet shattered in less than 2 hours. The Urani dreadnoughts arrived at the Tevani system to find a Dralith carrier swarm waiting for them. Thousands of small, fast attack craft that swarmed around the massive Urani ships like insects around a wounded animal, too small and too fast for the dreadnoughts' heavy weapons to track, and they tore those magnificent ships apart piece by piece, while the Urani commanders screamed for support that never came. The Tessic electronic warfare fleet successfully blinded a Dralith occupation force above the colony world of Rashan. But blinding the enemy meant nothing when there were no allied combat ships close enough to exploit the advantage, and the Tessic watched helplessly as their jamming fields flickered and the Dralith adapted, and Rashan fell. 3 battles, 3 defeats, and not because the Conquered lacked power, but because that power had never been forged into a single weapon. Ambassador Shakal sat on the Wartime Emergency Council that had replaced the normal assembly, and he watched his colleagues argue and blame each other, and demand that their own species take command of the combined forces, which was exactly what every other species was also demanding, and he began to understand something terrible. The Conquered had not fought a real war in so long that it had forgotten how. Their fleets were parade militaries designed to look impressive at diplomatic functions. Their doctrines were theoretical exercises that had never been tested against an enemy that wanted to kill them. And their officers were politicians in uniform who had earned their ranks through connections rather than combat. The Dralith were none of these things. The Dralith were predators, and their entire civilization was built around the principle of conquest, and they had spent 6 centuries perfecting the art of breaking, exactly the kind of fragmented coalition that the Conquered was now trying to assemble. After the 3rd defeat, the Emergency Council held a closed session to discuss options, and someone, Shakal could never remember exactly who, suggested reaching out to humanity for military support. The suggestion was met with the kind of uncomfortable silence that happens when everyone in a room knows they are about to do something humiliating. Humanity was the youngest species in the Conquered. They had the smallest registered fleet. They held no seats on any senior military council, and their ships were considered ugly and over-engineered by every standard of galactic naval architecture. But they had ships, and the conquered needed ships, so a formal request was drafted and sent to the human delegation. Director Elaine Mwangi received the request in her office aboard the Terran diplomatic station, and she read it carefully, and then she read it again, and then she called Admiral Leclerc on a secure channel, and they spoke for 40 minutes. When Mwangi walked into the emergency council chamber, she was calm in a way that Shakal found unsettling because it was not the calm of someone who did not understand the situation. It was the calm of someone who understood it completely and had been expecting it. The council representatives laid out their request with as much dignity as they could manage, which was not very much because they were essentially asking the youngest and weakest member of their alliance for help after ignoring that member for 83 years. Mwangi listened without interrupting, and when they finished, she folded her hands on the table and said in a voice that carried no emotion at all, "We will help, but we require full tactical authority over all combined military operations for the duration of the conflict." The council chamber erupted. The Varenthi ambassador called the demand absurd. The Urani representative slammed his massive fist on the table and declared that his species would never take orders from prey animals. And the Tessic delegate launched into a lengthy statistical argument about why human military theory was fundamentally unsound. Mwangi waited for the shouting to stop. Then she spoke again in that same flat, calm voice. "You can accept our terms now, or you can accept them after you lose Varenthi Prime. Either way you will accept them because you have no other choice. The Draelith are not going to stop, and you cannot stop them alone. You have proven that 3 times already." The silence that followed was worse than the shouting. Shakal looked at the human woman, and for the first time in his life, he did not see a representative of a minor species. He saw something much older and much harder, something forged in a fire that the conquered had never experienced. Mwangi stood and walked to the door and paused. "You have my communication frequency. I suggest you use it before the next battle, not after." She left. 4 days later, the Draelith destroyed the Conquered's 4th combined fleet at the Battle of Hollow Gate, and this time the casualties included 2 Varenthi colony worlds that burned just as the Cathari homeworld had burned. The Emergency Council voted that night. The vote was not unanimous because the Urani refused to participate and 3 other species abstained, but it passed. Humanity was granted provisional wartime command of all conquered military forces. The decision was made not out of respect or trust or any recognition of human capability. It was made out of pure desperate terror. And that was enough for Admiral Leclerc. When she received the notification, she was already standing in the command center of the TNS Resolute, the flagship of the United Terran Navy, and she turned to her operations officer and said, "Signal all Long Watch elements, Phase 3 is authorized. Tell them to come home, all of them." Her operations officer looked at her and asked how many ships they were recalling. Leclerc did not smile, but something shifted behind her eyes. Something that might have been pride, or might have been sorrow, or might have been the weight of what was about to happen. "All of them," she said again. And across the galaxy, in hidden shipyards buried inside asteroids and construction platforms drifting in the void between stars and deep space facilities that no conquered sensor had ever detected, humanity's real fleet began to wake up. The Acheron threshold was a stretch of empty space near humanity's border colonies that no one in the Conquered had ever paid attention to because there was nothing there worth paying attention to. Just a few scattered asteroid fields and some dim brown dwarf stars, and the kind of cold, quiet darkness that made even seasoned spacers feel small. That was where Admiral Leclerc told the galaxy to look. She sent a single transmission to the Conquered Emergency Council that read Terran War Fleet Assembly in progress at the Acheron threshold. All Allied observation vessels are welcome to attend. And then she went silent. Ambassador Shakal was among those who came to watch, because by now curiosity about humanity's actual military capability had become the most urgent question in the Concord. And he made the journey aboard a Varenthi diplomatic cruiser, along with military observers from 36 different species, all of them expecting to see a modest fleet of perhaps a few hundred human warships, because that was what humanity's registered fleet numbers suggested they could field. The Varenthi Intelligence Service had done a thorough analysis and concluded that humanity could realistically deploy between 400 and 700 combat vessels, which was respectable for a species their age, but would barely make a dent against the Dralith Armada that now numbered over 20,000 ships spread across the occupied territories. Shakal stood on the observation deck of his cruiser and watched the empty darkness of the Acheron threshold and waited. The first ships came out of faster-than-light transit at dawn by Terran Standard Time, which meant nothing in the void of space, but humans were sentimental about things like that. It was a destroyer group, 16 ships in tight formation, sleek and angular and painted in the flat black that humans used for their warships, and they moved with a precision that Shakal had never seen from human vessels before, because the human ships he had seen before were civilian transports and trade frigates, not purpose-built killing machines. Then came another group, and another and another. Shakal watched from the observation deck as the arrivals did not stop. Destroyers came in wolf-pack formations of 16, then carrier groups built around massive flat-deck ships that bristled with launch bays, then heavy cruiser lines that moved with the slow, deliberate menace of predators who know they cannot be challenged, then siege ships covered in weapon batteries so dense they looked like metal forests, then electronic warfare vessels studded with sensor arrays and jamming equipment, then troop transports armored like fortresses, then supply ships and repair vessels and medical frigates and ammunition haulers and fuel tankers and command ships and scout corvettes and mine layers and things that Shakal could not even identify because they did not match any known classification in the Concord's naval databases. They kept coming. For 6 hours they kept coming. By the time the last formation dropped out of faster-than-light transit and took its position in the assembly area, the Acheron threshold was no longer empty space. It was a wall of metal and fire and death. 14,217 warships. The number spread through the Concord like a shockwave, and it left silence in its wake, because no one could understand how this was possible. Humanity's official fleet registry filed with the Concord listed 612 vessels, mostly patrol corvettes and border defense frigates, and the Concord had accepted that number without question because why would anyone lie about their fleet size? What possible reason could a minor species have for hiding an armada that dwarfed the combined navies of most elder species? The answer was so simple that it was almost insulting. Humanity had registered their peacetime patrol force and nothing else because no one had asked about anything else, and the Concord's inspection protocols were designed for trust-based verification, which meant they relied on self-reporting, and humans had reported exactly what they wanted the galaxy to know. The war fleet had always been separate. It had been built in deep space facilities far from any trade route or sensor network, funded through channels that did not appear in any budget the Concord could audit, crewed by personnel who officially held civilian positions, and trained in the vast empty spaces between stars where no one ever went because there was no reason to go there. Except humanity had a reason. They had been preparing for this exact moment for 83 years. Shakal stood on the observation deck and stared at the Armada, and he felt something shift inside him, something fundamental, like a foundation cracking beneath a building that he had always believed was solid. He had spent his entire career thinking of humanity as a young species that was eager and hardworking but ultimately minor, A civilization that would need another 1,000 years of growth before it could truly matter on the galactic stage. He was looking at the proof that everything he believed was wrong. But it was not just the size of the fleet that frightened him, it was how it moved. The Conquered's fleets were impressive in formation, but they moved like parade groups, beautiful and coordinated and designed to look good on sensor displays. But the human armada moved differently. It moved the way a hunting pack moves, every ship aware of every other ship, formations shifting and flowing with a fluidity that spoke of thousands of hours of live exercises, not simulations, not theoretical war games, but actual practice in actual space with actual weapons. These humans had been training for war, while the galaxy thought they were building trade ships. The military observers from the other species were silent on their ships, and Shakal knew they were all thinking the same thing he was thinking. If humanity hid this, what else did they hide? What other capabilities were tucked away in the dark spaces of human territory? What other contingencies had they planned for? What other secrets had they kept behind those polite smiles and patient requests for trade corridor access? The answer was terrifying because it was unknowable. Humanity had just demonstrated that the galaxy did not know them at all, had never known them, had looked at them and seen what it wanted to see rather than what was actually there. And now the mask was off, and what stood revealed was not a junior species still finding its footing among the stars. It was something ancient in spirit if not in years, something shaped by a history of violence and survival that had taught it one lesson above all others. Be ready. Always be ready. Admiral Leclerc stood on the bridge of the TNS Resolute at the center of the Armada, and she looked out at her fleet and she felt the weight of it, not pride, not excitement, just the heavy, terrible knowledge of what all those ships meant and what they were about to do. She opened a channel to the entire fleet, human and allied vessels alike, and when she spoke her voice was steady and stripped of all decoration. Says Admiral Leclerc to all fleet elements, I will not give you a long speech because you do not need one. You know why you are here and you know what is at stake. The Draelith believe that conquest is the natural order of things. They believe that the strong take and the weak perish, and that this is how the universe is supposed to work. We are going to teach them that nothing is inevitable. All battle groups confirm readiness and prepare for transit. Our first objective is the liberation of the Sorathi corridor. 6 systems under Draelith occupation with an estimated 3,000 enemy warships. We will break them. We will free those systems. And then we will keep going, Leclerc out. The channel closed. Across 14,000 ships, crews moved to battle stations and weapons systems came online and engines powered up, and the Armada began to move. Not like a fleet, but like a single living thing, a predator uncoiling from the dark. Shakal watched it go, and he realized with a certainty that settled into his bones like ice, that the galaxy was about to learn what humans looked like when they stopped being polite. He was not sure the galaxy was ready for that lesson. He was certain the Draelith were not. The Sorathi corridor fell in 9 days, and the galaxy had never seen anything like it. The Draelith had fortified the corridor with 3,000 warships spread across 6 occupied systems, each system locked down with orbital defense platforms and gravity well disruptors and carrier groups, positioned to respond to any incursion from predictable approach vectors. Admiral Leclerc did not use predictable approach vectors. She split the Armada into 12 independent battle groups and sent them at the corridor from 12 different directions simultaneously, each group operating under sealed orders that contained not just a primary objective but 14 contingency plans, labeled alphabetically from A through N. And every captain in every battle group had been trained to switch between those plans in real time based on conditions on the ground, without waiting for orders from above. The Draelith had never fought an enemy like this. They were accustomed to the conquered style of warfare, which was stately and sequential, and involved large fleet formations exchanging fire at range until one side withdrew. a kind of formalized violence that the Drullith had learned to defeat centuries ago. Human warfare was not stately. Human warfare was chaos with a plan. The first system in the corridor fell when a puck of 64 destroyers came screaming out of faster-than-light transit directly inside the Drullith defensive perimeter, so close that the orbital platforms could not depress their weapons fast enough to track them, and the destroyers tore through the defense grid like teeth through flesh before the Drullith commander even understood what was happening. The second system fell when a Terran electronic warfare squadron blinded the entire Drullith sensor network for 11 minutes, and in those 11 minutes 3 carrier groups launched 900 strike fighters that dismantled the Drullith carrier swarm in a coordinated assault so precise that Allied observers would later describe it as surgical. Except surgery implied healing, and there was no healing in what those fighters did. The third and fourth systems fell simultaneously, because Luck had anticipated that the Drullith would reinforce one when the other was attacked. So she attacked both at the same time, and the reinforcement fleet that tried to respond to both threats found itself caught between 2 human battle groups in open space, with nowhere to retreat. The fifth system fell because its Drullith garrison commander looked at what had happened to the other 4 systems and surrendered, which was the first time a Drullith military officer had surrendered to anyone in recorded history. The sixth system fought to the last ship. The Allied species serving under human command during the Corridor campaign experienced something that fundamentally changed how they understood warfare. Varuntha weapons officers who had spent their careers practicing long-range precision strikes found themselves integrated into combined arms formations, where their skills were used not as a primary doctrine, but as one element in a constantly shifting tactical symphony. And they discovered that their precision fire was devastatingly effective when paired with human electronic warfare and tussock sensor disruption, and Urani heavy armor. Urani dreadnought crews who had always fought as independent heavy platforms found themselves serving as anchor points for human battle formations, their massive ships providing fire support and shield coverage, while faster human cruisers and destroyers maneuvered around them. And for the first time, the dreadnoughts were not isolated targets, but the protected heart of a combined fleet. Tussock electronic warfare specialists who had always operated alone found their capabilities amplified 100-fold when human tactical officers fed them real-time targeting data and coordinated their jamming cycles with offensive operations, turning what had always been a passive defense tool into an active weapon. The humans made it work because they had spent 83 years studying every species in the Conquered, learning their strengths and weaknesses, and building contingency plans that used each species' capabilities in ways those species had never imagined. And then there were the boarding actions. When the human Marines came for a Drullith capital ship, they came in breaching pods that were essentially armored coffins fired from torpedo tubes directly at the enemy hull, a delivery method so insane that every other species had abandoned it thousands of years ago, because the casualty rates were considered unacceptable. Humans found the casualty rates acceptable. They crashed through enemy hulls in their pods, and they fought through corridors in powered armor with weapons designed for close combat in enclosed spaces, room by room and deck by deck. And they took those ships, or they died trying, and sometimes both. The Drullith had never been boarded. Their ships were not designed for internal defense, because no one had been crazy enough to try, and the shock of finding armored humans inside their own vessels, fighting with a ferocity that bordered on madness, broke something in the Drullith military psyche that all the fleet battles had not touched. 6 weeks after the fall of the Sarutha Corridor came the battle that would be remembered longest. The Battle of Cathari's Ghost. The Cathari Humwald system was a graveyard now. The planet itself, a burned and broken thing surrounded by a vast field of debris from the original defense fleet. And the Drullith had stationed their largest remaining armada there because it was symbolically important, a trophy of their greatest victory. Luck wanted it back. She wanted it back not because the system had strategic value, but because the Cathari had been a gentle and peaceful people who deserved better than to have their grave guarded by the creatures that killed them. She brought 4,000 ships to the system, and the Drulloth had 5,000 waiting for her, and by every conventional calculation, the numbers favored the defenders, especially in a system full of debris that made fleet maneuvers dangerous and unpredictable. Luck did not see the debris as a problem. She saw it as a weapon. She sent her self-puck destroyers into the debris field first, weaving between shattered hulls and tumbling asteroid fragments at speeds that the Drulloth considered suicidal, and those destroyers began hurting the debris, using tractor beams and precise weapons fire to push and pull the floating wreckage into new configurations. And the Drulloth watched this with confusion, because it made no tactical sense. Until it did. When Luck sprung the trap, the debris field had been reshaped into a killing corridor, a three-dimensional maze of wreckage that channeled the Drulloth fleet into tight formations, where their numerical advantage became a death sentence, and the human battle groups were waiting at every choke point, with their weapons charged and their targeting solutions locked. The Battle of Cathari's Ghost lasted 4 hours, and in those 4 hours the Drulloth lost over 2,000 warships, the largest single defeat in their civilization's history, and it happened in the graveyard of the people they had murdered. Ambassador Shuckle was aboard a command ship during the battle, serving as the Conquered's official liaison to the human fleet, and when the firing stopped and the void was full of burning Drulloth wreckage, he found himself standing next to a human captain named Urbvara, who was bleeding from a gash on her forehead, where a console had exploded during the fighting. He asked her if she was afraid. She looked at him with eyes that were exhausted and red, and she smiled in a way that made Shuckle's skin crawl, because it was not a smile of victory. It was the smile of someone who had been carrying a heavy weight for a very long time. "I have been afraid my whole career," she said. "That is why I am still alive." Shuckle did not understand that answer then. He would later. That night the Drulloth High Command did something they had never done before in their entire history as a spacefaring civilization. They ordered a strategic withdrawal. The predators were retreating, and the species that had chased them to this point was the one the galaxy had dismissed as minor and unimportant, and not worth remembering the name of. Humanity was not done yet. The Armada reached the border of Drulloth sovereign space on the 93rd day of the war, and then it stopped. Every Allied commander in the fleet expected what came next, the final push into Drulloth territory, the burning of their worlds, the annihilation of their species, the kind of total absolute victory that the Drulloth themselves would have pursued if the positions were reversed. Admiral Luck gave the order to hold position. The reaction from the Allied species was immediate and furious. The Varuntha admiral attached to the combined fleet demanded to know why the advance had stopped when the enemy was broken and retreating. When their worlds were undefended and their fleets were shattered, and every principle of military logic dictated that you press the advantage until there is nothing left to press against. The Urani battle commander transmitted a message to the Resolute that was essentially a long string of profanity in 3 languages, demanding that the humans stop being cowards and finish what they started. 3 Tessic intelligence officers formally protested the halt in a document that was 16 pages long and cited 47 precedents from galactic military history. Leclerc read none of them. She opened a channel to the Drulloth High Command on an unencrypted frequency that every ship in both fleets could hear, and she spoke in the same flat, steady voice she always used. "This is Admiral Constance Leclerc of the United Terran Navy to the Drulloth Hegemony High Command. I am offering terms: full and immediate withdrawal from all occupied conquered territory, the release of all prisoners and captive populations, war reparations to every species whose worlds were damaged or destroyed, dismantling of all offensive fleet capability under monitored supervision, and a permanent demilitarized zone along your border with conquered space. In exchange, your homeworlds will not be touched, your civilian population will not be harmed, and your species will survive. You have 72 hours to accept. Leclerc out. The Allied fleet nearly mutinied. Shakal watched from the bridge of the liaison ship as communications channels exploded with outrage from every species in the coalition. The Cathari survivors screamed for justice. The Varenthi demanded that the Draelith pay for every life taken with lives of their own. The Urani threatened to break from the coalition and attack the Draelith homeworlds independently. Leclerc addressed them all in a single transmission. I understand your anger and I respect it. Every species in this coalition has suffered losses that cannot be measured and cannot be made right. But I will not use this fleet to commit genocide. The destruction of a species is not a military objective. It is a crime. And I will not lead humanity or any of our allies into that crime, no matter how justified it may feel in this moment. If any member of this coalition wishes to launch an independent attack on Draelith civilian populations, they are free to leave the combined fleet and do so on their own, without human ships, without human weapons, without human support. That is my final word on the matter. No one left. Not because they agreed with her, but because without the human fleet behind them, no single species had the power to break the Draelith defenses around their homeworlds, and every commander in the coalition knew it. The Draelith accepted the terms with 14 hours to spare. The war was over. In the months that followed, the Conquered rebuilt itself, and the scars of that rebuilding were visible in everything. The Cathari homeworld was declared a memorial system, closed to all traffic except pilgrimage vessels, and a permanent Conquered station was built in orbit where the names of 7 billion dead were inscribed on walls of black glass that caught the light of the scarred planet below. The Draelith dismantled their offensive fleets under human supervision, and the process was methodical and thorough, and entirely without cruelty, which confused the Draelith because they had expected vengeance and instead received bureaucracy. The Conquered Assembly reconvened for the first time since the war in a new chamber built to replace the one that had been evacuated during the crisis. And the first order of business was the restructuring of galactic governance. Humanity was offered a permanent seat on the Security Council, the inner circle of power that had governed the galaxy for 12,000 years, a seat that was held by only 7 species, each of them ancient and powerful and proud. Director Elaine Mwangi accepted the seat. Then she added a condition. Conquered failed because it was not a real alliance. It was a collection of individual species pretending to cooperate while maintaining separate militaries and separate doctrines and separate chains of command. That cannot continue. We propose a unified military command with shared doctrine, joint training programs, mutual defense obligations that are automatic rather than subject to debate, and a combined rapid response force that can deploy within hours rather than weeks. This is not optional. This is the price of the lesson we all just learned. The proposal passed because no one in that chamber had forgotten what happened when the Conquered tried to fight alone, and because the human armada was still assembled at the Acheron threshold, and its presence was a reminder that was impossible to ignore. Ambassador Shakal retired from diplomatic service 3 months after the war ended, and he spent the next 2 years writing his memoirs, which became the most widely read book in the Conquered within a year of publication. He titled it The Adults in the Room, and in its final chapter he wrote about what the galaxy got wrong about humanity. We looked at them and saw a young species, he wrote. We saw their clumsy ships and their redundant systems and their obsessive training, and we thought these were the signs of immaturity, of a civilization that had not yet learned to be efficient, that had not yet grown beyond the need to prepare for things that would never happen. We were wrong about all of it. The redundancy was not inefficiency. It was survival. built by a species that knew from bitter experience that anything that can break will break at the worst possible moment. The training was not paranoia. It was the discipline of a people that understood what it meant to be caught unprepared, because they had been caught unprepared before, and they had paid for it in blood so many times that the lesson was written into their very souls. He wrote about sitting on the bridge of the human flagship and watching the officers work and being struck by how calm they were. Not the calm of people who did not feel fear, but the calm of people who had made their peace with fear and decided to work alongside it rather than pretend it did not exist. He wrote about asking Captain Rivera if she was afraid, and hearing her say that she had been afraid her whole career, and understanding finally months later what that meant. It meant that humans did not prepare for war because they were warlike. They prepared for war because they knew how terrible war was. They had fought each other for their entire history, thousands of years of blood and fire on a single small world before they ever reached the stars, and that history had taught them something that no other species in the conquered had ever learned, because no other species had paid the price that humans had paid. They learned that the universe does not care about your comfort or your peace or your survival, that the only thing standing between civilization and destruction is the willingness to prepare for the worst and the strength to face it when it comes, and that the cost of preparation is always less than the cost of being unprepared. The final passage of the memoir was the one that was quoted most often in the decades that followed. We thought humanity was the galaxy's youngest child, stumbling and eager and not yet wise enough to sit at the table with its elders. We were wrong. They were not the youngest child. They were the only adults in the room, and we did not realize it until the room was on fire, and they were the only ones who knew where the exits were. On Earth, 3 months after the war ended, Admiral Constance Leclerc stood alone in front of a memorial wall made of white stone that stretched across a hillside overlooking the ocean. There were names on that wall. 847,000 names. Every human who died in the war, from the admiral who went down with her carrier at the Battle of Cathari's ghost to the 19-year-old Marine who died in a boarding pod that never reached its target. Every single one of them recorded and remembered on this wall above the sea. Leclerc had read every name. It had taken her 11 days. She placed her hand flat against the cool stone, and she stood there for a long time with the wind coming off the water, and the sun going down behind the hills, and the weight of all those names pressing against her palm. "We kept the wolves out," she whispered. Then she lowered her hand and walked away, and the memorial stood in the fading light with its 847,000 names, facing the stars that humanity had fought and bled and died to protect. The galaxy would not forget, and humanity would make sure of it. Not through threats or displays of power, but through the quiet, steady work of building something worth defending, because that was what humans had always done. They built things and they defended those things, and when the things they built were broken they grieved, and then they built again. That was the lesson the galaxy learned when the first human war Armada appeared. That was the mistake they would never make again.